This is lecture 5A for History 111. I want to talk about the Persian empires today. First of all, I have to explain who the Persians were. Now, we've talked already about the Harappan civilization, which is in northwestern India, and we've talked about ancient Mesopotamia and all the civilizations there up in the Fertile Crescent and the Mesopotamian river valleys, which is modern-day Iraq. Well, in between those two places, there is the territory called Iran or Persia. And this territory is dominated by mountain ranges. There are mountain ranges both separating Iran from Mesopotamia and from India, and most of Iran is a high central plateau. It's kind of a pretty mountainous region all over. Well, this area was, of course, right between these two civilizations, Harappa and ancient Mesopotamia, and during that period, we see migrations of peoples out of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the so-called Indo-Europeans, and some of these would go on to India and become the Aryans that we encountered already. But a significant number of them would stay in Persia, and there were two sort of ethnic groups in particular who stayed in Persia: the Medes and the Persians. And the Persians settled in southern Persia, southern Iran, what's southern Iran today, and was called Persia then. The Medes settled in what today would be northern Iran. And these were initially nomadic peoples. The Indo-Europeans were nomads. They had horses. They practiced pastoralism, but then they developed settled agriculture, and they began to develop a sort of peripheral civilization to the two civilizations on either side, Harappa and ancient Mesopotamia. But those peoples began to organize themselves, and they had some intrinsic military advantages in that they were horsemen. They knew how to ride horses well. They knew how to fight from horseback. And later with the Parthians, we'll see that they develop heavier horses, stronger horses that are able to carry men with armor and things like that. So they develop heavy cavalry. But basically what happens is that the Persians would develop a series of empires, and these would become enormous empires, basically stretching from India to the Mediterranean, that would last throughout what we're going to call the Classical Era, which is about 500 BCE to 500 CE. And so I want to talk about there's really four empires that emerge in succession in Persia, centered in Persia during this time period, and so I want to talk about each of those. The first is the Achaemenid Empire. The Achaemenid Empire was founded in 558 BCE, was destroyed in 330 BCE. It was founded by Cyrus the Great. Now, he was initially just sort of a small king in Persia, but he began to conquer his neighbors and build up a power base, and then he just sort of sweeps out of Persia, and he conquers both to the east all the way to modern-day India, and then he conquers to the west all the way to the Mediterranean. And the core of Cyrus's army here is cavalry. And so the Achaemenid Empire is 558 to 330 BC, and it was the biggest empire the world had ever known at that point. It was absolutely enormous, but it gets destroyed in 330 BCE by another sort of horseback riding nomad, Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great was an interesting character. He sort of comes out of nowhere from northern Macedonia, and I'll talk about him later in a little bit in the ancient Greece lecture. But Alexander the Great develops several new military tactics, and he takes this really big army of about 48,000 men across from Greece into modern-day Turkey. He then confronts the Persians, and he wins a whole series of battles. He's just a military genius, and he wins a whole series of battles against the Persians and basically destroys the Persian Empire. He then also conquers Egypt. So he's in control of Greece originally. He conquers Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, down through the Middle East into Egypt. Then he goes across through Mesopotamia into Iran, and he winds up fighting all the way over into Afghanistan, Pakistan, and into India. But Alexander the Great would die after just a really short career. He actually dies in 323 BC. So he sort of sweeps in and conquers the entire Persian Empire. as well as some additional territories, and then he dies. And what happens after that is that his empire gets broken up as his top generals start fighting over who gets what, and they basically form several successor empires, right? The Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, a Greek empire, and then the Antigonid Empire in Greece, and then the Seleucid Empire in Persia. And the Seleucid Empire is named after the general Seleucus, who was one of General Alexander the Great's generals, who takes over Persia, and he founds this empire. Now he's Greek, right? So his army is Greek, and so the Seleucid Empire, which is you'll see the dates here, 323 to 64 BC. The Seleucid Empire is essentially a Greek elite ruling over a Persian population, well, actually multiple ethnic groups. And the Seleucid Empire is kind of interesting because they actually carried out what we would call Greek colonization. The Seleucids actually built new cities, and they would encourage Greeks to move from Greece to various parts of Persia to become the core elites in these cities. And the key to this was that they were setting up massive trade networks. They were setting up trade networks that would connect India to Egypt to Greece and the Mediterranean. And so these trade cities with these Greek elites become automatic sort of trade networks. And so the Seleucid Empire creates a really cosmopolitan culture, right? You've got Greek culture mixing with Persian culture. You've got influences from India. You've got influences from the Middle East. And this is a really fascinating culture that develops. And in fact, there's still DNA evidence today of people in Afghanistan who have really strong Greek genetics. And so the Seleucids are this Greek sort of empire ruling over a multi-ethnic population. But there's a fair bit of resentment against the Greeks. And so the next empire that comes along is the Parthians. And the Parthian Empire is kind of interesting. You'll notice the dates don't seem to line up here, right? That the Parthian Empire starts in the middle of the Seleucid Empire, and the Seleucid Empire ends in the middle of the Parthian Empire. What's happening here is that the Parthians are a nomadic group from northern Persia again. And they basically they've migrated into northern Persia from Central Asia, and they put together a military force, and they start to carve out a little kingdom for themselves right out of the Seleucid Empire. All right? And so what they're basically doing is they just sort of start off as a little chunk of the Seleucid Empire, and they rebel, and they create a little independent kingdom, and they fight off the Seleucids. And then over the next several centuries, they would gradually expand their territory, and they sort of eat the Seleucid Empire from the inside, because they're basically just constantly fighting against the Seleucids and conquering more and more Seleucid territory, until finally the last of the Seleucid territories is conquered in 64 BCE. But the Parthians would go on for another 160 years, and so the Parthian Empire takes over where the Seleucid left off, and you'll see from the maps here that these empires vary quite a bit on the periphery in terms of how much of India, how much of Egypt, etc. they control, but the core of all these empires is Persia. Well, the Parthians are finally knocked off in 224 CE by the Sassanids. And what's interesting about the Sassanids is the founders of the Sassanid Empire are actually descendants of Cyrus the Great. So it's sort of like they did this complete circle where you have the original Persians get conquered by the Greeks, who get conquered by the Parthians, who get conquered by the original Persians again. And the Sassanids basically rule an empire for about 400 years. They eventually, as we'll see, get knocked off by the rise of Islam and these Muslim armies coming out of the Middle East, out of the Arabian Peninsula. So overall, what the Persians do then is for about 1,100 years, they have a series of 4 major empires that are focused in Persia and extend pretty much all the way from India to the Middle East, although they vary quite a bit on how much of the Middle East they can control. And these are some of the biggest empires the world's ever seen. So in the next part of the lecture, I want to talk about how these empires are fundamentally different from the smaller kingdoms of ancient Sumeria or the Assyrians or something like that. So that's what I'll talk about in the next part.